Matt, the philosopher, and I are here today for a very special event. We are going to start together reading Piranesi. And there's just so much there that we have decided to read it out loud to you and then talk about it. But before we get started, Matt said that he had written something that would give us kind of an overarch of the whole theme of the book. And have at it, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. So one big takeaway from these 4 paragraphs will be the problem, which is the Ship of Theseus, the problem of composition, and how it relates to memory, which I think is an overarching concern in Piranesi. Here is a thesis. Novels are passionate technologies. When is a ship finally a ship? Or when does the house become the house? Windows, roof, front door, back door. This is a Ship of Theseus problem, and it has been the inner ear problem of philosophy ever since the falling of Thales into a well. Hundreds of years later, after René Descartes put all the scholastic presuppositions in the fire and showed that predicates burn like wax in the scientific gaze, for which the subject has no standing power with the exception of thinking itself. Immanuel Kant cobbled together the Critique of Pure Reason and demonstrated that the limit is normative, and therefore the normative is the limit. If regulation is the key to human virtue, then what shall we do with human potential? Here is where the idea of passion steps in, and where the idea of the novel finds its passion. But the question remains, is the Ship of Theseus thereby constructed? The passion of Piranesi is longing, and as such it is analogous to the neoclassical impulse, which gives rise to the 3-dimensional inclusion of all human passions in a cosmic poem, even though some would diagnose these passions to be anxieties and lay at the feet of Western civilization the tears of the romantics in the place of the cleared view of inner resolve. Which of the two are in the book is an open question. In summary, the straight line and the curve, the dialectic of order and chaos, and how these binaries bond to meet the demands of beauty, which is a material contract with truth, on the terms of good memory, actually is a problem reminiscent of the Ship of Theseus. Or, in other words, it is a problem of how to find your way in a house that is not yours yet. Therefore, I conclude the problem of reconstruction is the problem of recollection. It is the problem of how to remember what the inheritance is when we are surrounded by it. Here, the prodigal son is apropos and Piranesi.
Wow, I think we could take several weeks to just unpack that, Matt. That is so tightly reasoned and beautifully crafted and artfully expressed. I'm almost speechless.
But it relates to memory. which
Yes, absolutely. And so many thoughts came up to me. But there are a couple things that I'm so dumb that I don't know about. So could you tell me briefly, what is the Ship of Theseus and what is the falling of Thales into a well?
so in the history of ideas, to take it backwards, most professors will say philosophy began with Thales, who was the first to abstract from his personal experience. And perhaps this is where, if we want to say, if we would like to find the origin of science, we might look.
Wasn't he also a mathematician?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Great one, a deep one. But one of the folk tales of his hagiography is that he was so taken up with higher things. One person said to him, "You're poor, Thales. All you do is think about these abstractions." And he said to you, "I do it by choice, not by poverty. In fact, if I wanted to, I could become wealthy, and I'll prove it to you." In a short period of time, because he took the time to understand the trading routes and what was selling, he made a fortune off wheat. And then he came back to his friend and said, "My hands are clean. I'm done. I told you I could, and I did."
You know why that's so, I got to tell you why that's so fascinating, because the reason that I know that Thales is a mathematician is not because of any study that I ever did, but I was always a big fan of Rex Stout's novels about Nero Wolfe, who was a grower of orchids and a brilliant detective. And in one of his cases, there is a guy named Milton Thales. He has a nom de plume of Milton Thales, an alias. And that is what allows Nero Wolfe to solve the crime, because he knew history, and that he knew from this guy that this guy was somehow using mathematics in the crime, and that he was using that name triggered for Wolfe this memory of Milton Thales. But the reason that I think that story is in the book is that Rex Stout didn't start writing novels until he was in his 50s or maybe late 40s. After that, he wrote 40 or 50 novels.
Wow.
But before that, he had a job working out some way of dealing with all the financial considerations of public schools. And his idea went through every public school in the country, and they all started setting up their books according to this idea of his. So he became immensely wealthy, which freed him up to become an author, which is exactly the story of of Thales, which is probably why Wolfe used that example in the book to solve the mystery.
I would imagine. Because
he knew that story, and how in fact, that may be how he got because he was brilliant, that may be how he got the idea to use financial wizardry to make his money. Isn't that funny?
So it is funny. So Thales's heart was not on things below, but on things above, in such a way that his head was always lifted as he walked. And this was the current of his days, which eventually led him to one of the realities of life, a gaping hole, an anomaly that took him in, consumed him. And this has been the plight of philosophers.
Oh, is that how he died? Is that how he died, actually? He fell into a well?
Oh, okay. No, thank God he was pulled out.
Okay. Wow. That would be too much. Yeah, so he must be the original absent-minded professor.
Precisely. And this leads us then backwards into the Ship of Theseus, which is a perennial problem, not only in philosophy, because philosophy mainly is an oratory of how to say everything in the right order at the right time. Not only does it affect philosophy at its root, but it affects indeed all manifestations of art at any level. Because what manifestations of art enjoy with the exposition of the philosopher is the need to construct a theory that holds water, that actually is a thing independent of the production that can be used for something else. And my goodness, how the gaps have situated themselves in between. Indeed, our writer, in one of her chosen epigraphs, alludes to this very perennial problem of the Ship of Theseus, which in concise form is, how does an object endure through time without breaking down into disarray? And indeed, after things break down into disarray, how are they ever reconstructed again? People call me...
That was the thing that really jumped out at me when you were reading your 4 paragraphs, because this whole problem of memory is tightly connected to the problem of entropy.
Yes.
Yes. And the problem of the reason that memory and entropy are connected is because of the problem of reconstruction. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot to talk about here.
So in the epigraph, she quotes The Secret Garden.
Well, that's another great book.
And in the quotation, this leads to what you said. I will quote now, May 1976. People call me a philosopher or a scientist or an anthropologist. I am none of those things. I am an anamnesiologist. I study what has been forgotten. I divine what has disappeared utterly. I work with absences, with silences, with curious gaps between things. I am really more of a magician than anything else. Someone who writes a book knows what they're doing and what they're doing it for. And I think, I mean, what do you, I know you've read this book before me, so you've had time to think of it ahead of me. As we go into this chapter 1, what is she setting us up for?
Well, I would like to just start reading and then tell you what my thoughts were as I read it this time. This is my 3rd time reading it. The first time I bought it to read as a novel because somebody had said it was a great book. So when I started reading it the first time, it took me a long time to get into it, probably 30 or 40 pages. Like, what is even happening here? And that's partly because I was not seeing it. I was not seeing it properly. Let's put it that way. And so it took a shift of vision. So then when Father John Beadle said, hey, let's talk about this book, I read it again. And then, so I had a focus then of talking with him about it. So I was more focused on kind of the perspective that he took on it, which was that it's tightly connected to this other part of her epigraph, The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. And so we were looking at it from that standpoint, because that epigraph says, I am the great scholar, the magician, the adept, who is doing the experiment. Of course, I need subjects to do it on. And the great scholar, the magician, the adept, and the magician's nephew is a pretty awful person. So the second time I read it, I was looking at it through the lens of the magician's nephew. This time I started reading it and I thought, this is a devotional.
Ooh.
Because right from the very first sentence, I'm gonna read the first 3 paragraphs, maybe.
One thing before you do, I realized, because in the past I've read a book aloud when I had a YouTube channel, and it graded out. So we have to be careful in our reading not to go too long within the book. We have to give it gaps, otherwise the algorithm will pick it up. Not that we're going to rob the author of their work, their sweat equity, but if we read too much at once of this book, it will flag us and shut down the video.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just go for the first 2 sentences then. When the moon rose in the third northern hall, I went to the ninth vestibule. I think that's just that's the label on this part of the book. It's just kind of the chapter name. Then it starts. Entry for the first day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. Well, okay, there's the first sentence. An entry for the first day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. My very first thought was, do I pay enough attention to my life that I could say what one year was from another year? This was the year that the albatross came to the southwestern halls. What was my last year, And it all of a sudden got me thinking about our focus and how we look at events and how we remember events and whether we are diligent with our attention. And then just the capacity of my memory to remember my life. Maybe if I had parsed out my years with a remembrance of the events that happened in each year, I would have a more comprehensive memory of my life. I mean, it made me think about a lot of things.
The one thing I've noticed in this first chapter, relating to your point, is how bare bones it is at the beginning, or seemingly so. It's, if you want to put a label on the technique, it's minimalist. And it's from the tight, lean view of first person. And so it's already constrained. It's one person talking about their life. But another level to that is we're not given the impression that we are meeting this person face to face, because we're not in the story world. We're reading their writing, their diary, their journal. So we're at a second remove from this already constrained consciousness.
And we're not given any background or any history to know what happened prior to jumping into this journal.
Exactly. And we'll soon find out we're jumping into this journal at the end of the world, or the penultimate, right? Because almost everyone's gone.
Don't tell too much ahead of time.
Okay, sorry. You're right.
I guess I'm assuming that everybody who's watching this has probably already read the book, but I do think that if we put too much spoiler in there at the beginning, it kind of ruins the discovery process of,
that's true.
Yeah, of what's happening.
That's true. Close reading. I discipline myself. Close reading. So already in the formal choice of this journal, we're at a second remove, which is fascinating, given the subject is, from the epigraphs, memory. This problem of recollection that you and I talked about before reading the sentence is canvassed here in the formal choice of representation. It's a journal. It's not a person talking to us. In fact, there's no hope of this person talking to us for all we can see yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of asking, why is that person there? We almost have to ask ourselves as the reader, because the fourth wall has been broken already. We're somewhere we may have been invited to, may not have. Here we are reading someone's journal. What are we doing here?
So I'll read a little bit more. When the moon rose in the third northern hall, I went to the ninth vestibule to witness the joining of 3 tides. This is something that happens only once every 8 years. Okay, my immediate thought when I read that was, this person is undergoing a lot of effort to witness something, because the ninth vestibule must be a long ways from wherever he is in, maybe the first vestibule, from the first to the ninth is probably a long ways. He went there at a certain time, which is when the moon rose. Sort of tells me that there's no other way to tell time in this place except by the sun and the moon. But then this is something that happens only once every 8 years. That is a statement of diligent observation. And it's the kind of thing that I always have pondered about with the ancient astronomers, that how did they have the patience to watch the movement of the stars through the sky and catalog them on a daily basis over long periods of time to figure out that there was some sort of a pattern there. And so how on earth did he know that, or she, that this is something that happens only once every 8 years? That means this person's been there at least 8 years, and this has happened once before, and they've kept track of all the tides during all that time so that they would know that this particular conjunction of the tides has only happened at least once in the last 8 years. That tells me a lot about that person.
Wow. You're right. And one word that kept coming up for me was longing and passion. And to go to that thesis of a novel as a passionate technology, if something's broken and the pieces are lying around, this goes to your assertion of patience. Where you see someone patiently gathering the pieces and fumbling and making errors, sinning, and yet dusting off their shoulder and continuing, letting a couple words drip out of their mouth, but then re-implementing perhaps a new paradigm with the technique, maybe going for advice, maybe storming away, but then coming back. Where, I mean, you can number all the pieces, you can find the subject, but where is the hope? And even without answering that, that figure in the room with all the pieces could be replaced by any human. It seems to be a universal emotion. And novels can tap into that without dogma, right? Without having to belong underneath a certain umbrella. They can just point to the fact that it's raining, and that's terrifying to hear the thunder. And wouldn't it be nice if we could all be under an umbrella, but we can't. And there are multiple umbrellas, and who gets to stand under which one for how long, and how will we negotiate this? And certainly there will be backbiting. And these are things we're accustomed to feeling and experiencing, but we're not accustomed to articulating them. We're accustomed sometimes to the struggle for articulation of them with someone we trust. And so the privacy of a book, which is a not too old invention, a couple hundred years, right? A private experience with a book that can be open and closed, that I can own. I won't find it chained to a building that I have to have permission to go into. And have this articulation put before me of this desire to see the tides. It's emblematic of why we read, perhaps one of the reasons why someone could go to a book. A book shaped with the printing press as its background. And just part of that, it's a family. This won awards. Winner's Prize for Fiction 2021 winner. It's been reviewed by CBS Sunday Morning. Destined to become a work of classic fantasy. This is simultaneous. It's reviewed by NPR, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times Book Review. So simultaneously, it is a serious book, but it's found its way into the popular mainstream. And I think part of how it's doing that is it's availing itself of the passion of longing. we hear often the sort of articulation of, well, for me, the glass is half full. For my neighbor, it's half empty. The tide is a embellishment of that very simple idea of, for your perception, is it half full or half empty? And what makes it so? What causes it to be? Well, this natural function that doesn't happen often. It's an event, and it's an event I've waited for it to be full or to recede. I don't know. I will go and see it because I've waited. And so it's that very simple idea that we can kind of tap into, but it's made on this larger scale of serious fiction that we're nevertheless having a private experience in.
That's a terrific statement of one of the big themes, I think, in the book is the glass half full or is it half empty? And you have to live that out along with the narrator, right? Step by step. Because it's that shift in perception. It's just so powerful. So the what you said about the private experience of a book was just so great. I was listening before we got on. I was listening to a conversation that Jonathan Peugeot was having with somebody. I can't remember his name. And they were talking about art, and that what has happened to art in the last few hundred years, making art for art's sake, just for nothing but something to hang on the wall and look at, rather than it being a community activity or making something for someone or for the church or for a group. And a book, in that, when you first said a book is a passionate technology, I thought, technology, huh? But it is a technology because it does get us into that frame of mind where we are alone with the book. It's just like me being alone with the work of art, or me being alone binge watching Breaking Bad or something, right? It's a solitary experience. And yet there's something about great books where you are having an experience simultaneously with the author and with all the other people who have read the book, and with the people who have critiqued the book, and with all the people who will read the book, and the people you want to tell about the book. and so there is a way that it can become a non-solitary experience. And it's a lot of fun having the experience with you, I have to say that.
And I think part of this can bring us into, without going too far afield, into Barfield territory. The fossil record of semiotics. So a word, if we're not concerned with the representation, what the word is being communicated for, but we want to know what is in the word being communicated, then we might avail ourselves of a dictionary. It's this ready-to-hand utensil for sounding out the possibilities in the form of synonyms, but also gaining a reach for what is contrary, the antonyms. And then we can get a little bit of depth through other human tongues by seeing where it was first used by an author. If you go into the Oxford dictionaries, you can find history of usages. And even back from that, if you start to scrape into the little eye socket of the fossil, you might find the derivation of the word in a more ancient language. But there, of course, you have speculation in place of fact about why these lone phonemes from the past were imported to this word and brought forward. And there things become swampy and murky, but possibly the hiding place of a pearl. In many seminaries, when someone's learning the Greek of the New Testament, they have to be motivated because it's dry. And so going through their cases, learning the tenses takes weeks, if not months, if not years, to become flexible. And to see the constructions of the gospel writers, The professor often will say, hey, here's a pearl. I'll show you.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
No, Siri. Here's a pearl. And then they'll show them a part in scripture where there's a pun intentionally made by the author that you do not see in English. And then this will put flame underneath maybe some of the future translators / poets in the classroom to press on and plow that ancient language. So the dictionary, the older dictionaries, but being with someone conversant in the literature and reading classic texts as touchstones to see what is going on presuppositionally, what's going on before the words are even put down, what's at stake. I think that would be a great question for this book for us to ask. What is at stake that Piranesi had to be written?
And contemporaneously, what's at stake that the narrator is writing this journal? So which we find out as we go along. So I'm going to read a little bit more here. So
please.
So the narrator has gone to the third northern hall and the ninth vestibule to witness the joining of three tides. The ninth vestibule is remarkable for the three great staircases it contains. Its walls are lined with marble statues, hundreds upon hundreds of them, tier upon tier, rising into the distant heights. I climbed up the western wall until I reached the statue of a woman carrying a beehive, 15 meters above the pavement. The woman is 2 or 3 times my own height, and the beehive is covered with marble bees the size of my thumb. One bee, this always gives me a slight sensation of queasiness, crawls over her left eye. I squeezed myself into the woman's niche and waited until I heard the tides roaring in the lower halls and felt the walls vibrating with the force of what was about to happen.
This is a Peugeot moment, that paragraph.
Go for it.
Well, I mean, us together. I really didn't have anything beyond that sentence.
Oh, but why is it a Peugeot moment?
Well, in the past, we've talked about detectives. You brought up the detective in terms of Thales. And ever since Raymond Chandler.
Yes.
And the hard-boiled mystery, which is a hard boiling of the genre. A level up from that, the genre making of mystery is a compression, tight frame of liturgy. And I don't just mean Orthodox, but any liturgical patterning out in 3 dimensions for human beings to process in. Now, commonly we'll hear people say, I'm processing my thoughts. It's a very Enlightenment notion. Even if we don't know it's an Enlightenment notion, it is. I'm processing my thoughts. We're also processing the air in our lungs. We're processing our feet when we go to work and when we come home from work, as the sun processes in its orbit, or us orbiting its relative stasis, however you want to look at it. These things are simultaneously conjoined. And so, of course, if one is given to a Jordan Peterson phrase, wanting to have the proper aim, they'll look for the star outside of the most frames where people process in as possible, to orient all those frames in sequence. But the time it takes to see it, in other words, the time it takes for the light of that thing, the signal of that thing, to make it through all those levels of givens, all those preconceived notions, is quite a long time. An indefinite amount of time. And that relates to the detective looking through the crime scene in the hard-boiled mystery, but also the astronomist, the astrologer, as you said, waiting years to check if their calculations are accurate. And it's this waiting for the signal to come through all the frames, like the ray of the sun coming through the atmosphere into where we are.
Is that why there's a connection to the liturgy, that waiting moment, or were you thinking something else? Because I understood what you were saying there about the genre making aspect of mystery being that it's a tightly compressed model. In most well-crafted mysteries, there isn't a single word that isn't there for a purpose, right? So you don't just get moments where you can contemplate something beautiful in a hard-boiled mystery. It's, if something is in that mystery, it's going to show up later as being important for some reason or another, even if it's only as a red herring to mislead you to some other place. But there's a very directed purpose in mysteries. But what was the aspect of mystery genre that you connected up with liturgy?
So with a liturgy, this connects with Piranesi and that paragraph in particular you read. In a liturgy, however ornate, there is the conjunction of the collective, everybody there supposed to be following along, watching the procession, participating in the procession, even if they're simply participating with their eyes, following the chalice when it's moved and brought in, or when the priest is speaking, letting the ears be attentive to those words and not the inner words of, did I leave the door unlocked? That choice and that the energy you put into keeping that choice as the direction your focus will go until you're rewarded as you're listening to the pastor speak, then, oh, something clicked. It's as if you went past a certain frame into another one that you could not have went into unless you had given it your attention. Another way of looking at that, finally the signal from outside came in at that moment. Well, which was it? Did you go out or did it come in? A hard-boiled mystery is analogous to those old charts of Ptolemy, Ptolemy. You know, those old, very concentrated, very ornate, detailed maps of the universe. Remember those things with those concentric circles and all the numbers and the symbols? Nothing was there by accident, so they thought. It was contrived. A hard-boiled mystery is the same thing with words. Not one word is without its purpose. And if I want to take a paragraph and say how beautiful, let me isolate my attention on it and really soak it in. The hard-boiled author would say, stop it. You wouldn't do that with one of the suns by Jupiter in a map of Ptolemy. The point is to see how that relates by trigonometry down over here, because we need this calculation about where the tides are over there. Don't you see? This book, Piranesi, though, with that paragraph you read, seems to me to invite the wandering eye to kind of, wow, why a beehive? And even if I don't want to ask that analytic question, wasn't it amazing they found a niche in time for the water to come around and the wave, the walls to pulsate? Man, that was vivid.
It is vivid, isn't it? I mean, when I read it, I could feel the thrumming of the water up against the walls. It's just a beautifully written book. Well, let's see what else is going to happen here. First came the tide from the far eastern halls. This tide ascended the easternmost staircase without violence. It had no color to speak of, and its waters were no more than ankle deep. It spread a gray mirror across the pavement, the surface of which was marbled with streaks of milky foam. Next came the tide from the western halls. This tide thundered up the westernmost staircase and hit the eastern wall with a great clap, making all the statues tremble. Its foam was the white of old fish bones, and its churning depths were pewter. Within seconds, its waters were as high as the waists of the first tier of statues. Now, when I read those two paragraphs, I immediately thought of that passage. Which book is it in? It's from one of the prophecies of Elijah, I think, when he starts talking about the water coming out from under the altar. And when the water begins to go out from under the altar, it goes out from the temple out into the streets. And at first it's only ankle deep. And then it keeps progressing or processing further out. And then it's knee deep, and then it's waist deep. And pretty soon it's covering up all the walls and fences, because now it's like neck deep. It's a beautiful picture of it's a beautiful prophecy of the movement of the Spirit, and how when the Spirit fills all spaces, there's no more need for walls between people. I'll see if I can round up the passage and link to it in the.
That's amazing.
In the description. But that's exactly what came to my mind when I was reading that part.
The earlier this week, I was thinking of water, and in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is hanging on the cross and he has given up his spirit, one of the soldiers pierces his side. They didn't break his bones. They broke the other two persons' bones on the other two crosses. Per Scripture, his bones were not broken, as St. Isaiah said. But when one of the soldiers pierced his side, two things came out: blood and water. And this is important, even if we do not know how to articulate why. Because in the very Gospel of John, many lines, words after that description, John goes out of his way to say, this is something I saw, and I know my testimony is true because I know what I saw. And I am writing this so you will believe that he didn't say the old, that you will believe the Scripture is filled, full, brimming. The Greek word pleroma or plethori. I can't help but think that relates to Ezekiel. Of course it would relate. As Jordan Peterson says, the Bible is hyperlinked. And it relates to the crossing of the Red Sea. The water was parted. There's a book I'm reading by Saint Gregory of it's the one Jonathan Peugeot mentioned, Saint Nyssa.
Well, there's a Gregory of Nyssa.
It might be him, the one who wrote or is credited with having written the Life of Moses. I don't remember either, but maybe it's St. Gregory of Nyssa. Maybe a commenter will help us in the comments. At any rate, when he describes the parting of the Red Sea, I'd never thought about it this way before. He describes it as Moses hitting the water with the staff, but then the water breaking like glass if you hit one side of the pane, for the crack to go through to the other end. So you don't have this natural, well, the water's going to flow in opposite directions and then the Israelites will walk through. No, when Moses' staff touches the water, it no longer behaves according to our preconceived notion of water flowing. It behaves like a solid, fractally oppositing itself. And in that unnatural decision, they walk through the deep as if they're on high ground. The opposites meet for the Israelites. And when the Egyptians go through, the Pharaoh, in their horses and chariots, it rushes together like a door being shut and the hinges coming together, and a bloodless death, because they are no more to be seen. And on the other side of that, the Israelites celebrated. So when Jesus was pierced by one of the soldiers and blood came out with water, and John is saying, this is important, and I actually saw it, and I know I saw it, and I know the scripture is filled full and brimming because of it. I would love to know more about how that prophecy of Elijah and the promise of the Spirit in going over the fences relates. And with this book going up the wastes of the
you might have been right back when you said Ezekiel. Maybe it was Ezekiel. Now I'm first you said Ezekiel and I said Elijah. Now you said Elijah, and I'm thinking maybe it was Ezekiel. Anyway, I'll find it.
But the water coming up to the waists of these statues, as if keeping time, right? Going up the tiers, filling it.
Yeah. And then what's going to happen is last came the tide from the northern halls. It hurled itself up the middle staircase, filling the vestibule with an explosion of glittering ice-white foam. I was drenched and blinded. When I could see again, waters were cascading down the statues. It was then that I realized I had made a mistake in calculating the volumes of the second and third tides. A towering peak of water swept up to where I crouched. A great hand of water reached out to pluck me from the wall. I flung my arms around the legs of the woman carrying a beehive and prayed to the house to protect me. The waters covered me, and for a moment I was surrounded by the strange silence that comes when the sea sweeps over you and drowns its own sounds. I thought that I was going to die, or else that I would be swept away to unknown halls, far from the rush and thrum of familiar tides. I clung on.
And there's a nice motif there in sequence. We're prepared for this onrush and the fear to have a vicarious experience of this fear and panic. That is prepared for us before the water comes, the queasiness of that bee coming to the eye of the statue. So this identification with stasis, solid object, that bee will never move from the eye, that eye will never blink. And so there's this tension ever present, like John Keats's Urn of a man chasing a woman in a sheepfold. It's a perennial image of love and joy and power, but also unfulfilled. And they're so close and yet so far, static, met with this bee right on the brow, can't be blinked underneath, prepares us for when all hell breaks loose. And we don't know if it'll ever be put on pause. It's chaos and order.
Well, and then he also says, I had miscalculated the volume of the second and third tides. So he's not only been watching the tides and keeping track of the tides over time so that he knows that the first, second, and third tides only have a conjunction this one time every 8 years. He's also been trying to calculate the volume of the tides based on the measurements of where they come up to in the house so that he knows exactly where to go in order to be safe from the tides when they come. And he thought he was in a safe place when he was in the niche, the woman's niche, the woman with the beehive. There's some deep symbolism going on there.
Incredibly deep. I mean, one of the things the novel offered people in its inception, its early experimentation, was escape from home to home. So you would have people in home reading books that were domestic novels. The plots were about intrigue in terms of will he or will he not say that he wants to marry so-and-so, but how will that affect the other person with a bigger dowry? And Pride and Prejudice and all the other books like it, where you're at home and yet reading a book about home that is not your home and never will be your home, and indeed never will be anyone's home. But in the same way that the number 2 is more than anything that will ever be a pair, you're reading something that has to somehow comment on everybody's home because it's so abstract and yet perfectly paired with whatever might come in and illustrate it. So just as the pair seems to be perfectly captured by the number 2, the house and all social struggles within a house seem to be perfectly captured by the domestic novel. But that can always be unmoored. You can always make the rope less tight and let the boat go further and further out into God knows where, the sea. That's postmodernism. That's heavy experimentation. That's Ulysses by James Joyce, where on the face of it, in a synopsis, James Joyce's Ulysses is a domestic novel. The character is walking through his hometown on his way home after meeting his father and thinking, my roommate, I should really kick him out. He has guests over that I don't approve of. What will I do? These are very trifling, pedantic things that James Joyce just pushes and ramrods. Troy, Shakespeare, everything he can think of that has nothing to do with these concerns, that don't fit with the parts, that couldn't possibly glue them together. And so it breaks all the time. Every other sentence seems to break the intention of making this thing comprehensible. And that's what has been the fate of the domestic novel since the early 20th century. Now this book steps in, and this character's consciousness steps in about finding that safe place at the right level, not too far down, but not too high up, right in the niche of the feminine, of the place of origin, of birth, but also safety, and the home, and the hearth, and all the symbolism attendant to it. It's a sort of meta commentary on the technology of the novel. But the fact that he's rushed away from his safe place that he thought, I don't know if that leads us to conclude that postmodernism is inevitable in literary representation, or if there is a way to keep our heads above the water of postmodern experimentation. I don't know.
Well, he clung on, he says. And then just as suddenly as it began, it was over. So he was safe, right? He prayed. Remember, he prayed in the middle there. He prayed to the house. I prayed to the house to protect me. One of the charming
the house
things
was not the niche.
That's right.
Yet the niche was in the house.
The niche is in the house. One of the charming things about the book is how many words are capitalized in every sentence. And the legs of the woman, legs and woman are capitalized. The waters covered me. The waters are capitalized. I prayed to the house to protect me. The house is capitalized. So it is, am I getting this right? He capitalizes every noun. I think that's what he's doing. He's capitalizing every noun. He's not capitalizing verbs or pronouns or particles or anything else, but he's capitalizing the nouns, which makes it very charming because you feel like there's something momentous about the elements of his existence, I guess.
And it gives them a certain solidness. When a noun is capitalized, it becomes a platonic solid. It's going to stay there. It's not a dandelion. It's a dandelion, right? It's really. And
that's like in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, when he talks about heaven being so much more solid than earth.
The grass blade is capital G.
Yes. And the grass is, to human feet that aren't yet accustomed to it, it's like a blade.
And so what's interesting then about that as well is you said water was capitalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
But water here finding itself verbing the house. But as you said, paradoxically, it's over as fast as it begun. Now, in the 20th century, I would say the 21st century, more than the 20th century, there was a book out, American Dirt. And this book received, I think it's a good book. Books are hard to write, so I never want to ever dismiss a single book. Writing a book, it's like building a house. It takes forever. You're never satisfied with it, and there are always problems to fix. So one should never dismiss a book, period. But many people dismiss the book on ideological grounds, probably because it was the current thing to do. But one of the things that I enjoyed in following the media attention paid to this book, American Dirt, which was a book about transition and threshold and stepping over and what it takes to step over the wire in times of duress and immediacy. Coincidentally, or not coincidentally, the book is written as a thriller. But the media attention paid to this transition was, do you have any right to tell the story of this character? And this leads to the demise or to the giving of a certain house. As Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms, many mansions, many houses. Where does the author belong in the history of the book? Before intellectual property laws, there was no such thing as the author. There were many authors who could freely take from each other, just as memory freely takes from the climate, the culture, its neighbors. Everything I've said is not me, right? It's everything I've stolen or borrowed or am embellishing or praising by letting it exit my house. But with intellectual property and with capitalism and with the idea of finishing a book on deadline and putting your name on it and selling it through a persona, these things became real problems. Problems for the postmodern to step in and say, how do we glue the author to the work? How do we glue the persona to the character in the book? How do we make it all fit nicely together in a life? There's a lot more room for that to break down than to go up. So with this book, American Dirt, people ask, what right do you have? But then they also put forward, well, maybe you have the right because mental illness is such that the private experience of the reader has to cope. And before it was how to escape the house into another home, the domestic novel. But now we know what the postmodern novel can do, and yet we're barraged by all these changes in this fourth industrial revolution. Our very imagination, what happens between our ears, is fraught with the trauma of excess and quick changing. In other words, the verbing through our memory palace. We need authors nowadays to teach us how to cope with that, which requires a certain structure and non-experimentation, but also a diagnosis of how experimentation can cross the line. And so you can write about this other person's experience if you do it in such a way that sheds light on the trauma of having to step over the wire. And so with this, I think there is a certain trauma, a perennial trauma of giving birth. I don't know what the percentage of men to women in the demographic calculus of the publishing house was, but giving birth, even if you're not the woman, if you're the father, there's tremendous anticipation as this being develops for those months. Anticipation of, do we have everything we need in order? Do we calculate for how much this will cost? Do I have the right job? Are we living close enough to our parents, but far enough away that we can have our own independence? Is everything prepared so that when it does happen, and there's no going back, that we'll stay above? Architectonically, it's at the beginning of the book. It's coming out of a niche, the woman's legs. If I was a literary professor, I would say this is symbolically about the trauma of giving birth. That's one reading. But that she's putting it in terms of these Platonic solids and of the calculation over a number of years of the neoclassical tradition of what to do in the 1500s as the predicates burn away in the wax of scientific theory and gaze. That's a brilliant thing to do with the novel, right? And we need to do that in the 21st century with novels. I got to turn the lights on.
Now I've got to see if I can get her to come and talk to me so I can find out if that's what she had intended. Because
that would be cool.
Yeah, wouldn't it? I mean, because what you said makes a lot of sense in terms of the symbolic aspect of it. Okay, I will continue. Then just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The joined tides swept on into the surrounding halls. I heard the thunder and crack as the tides struck the walls. The waters in the 9th vestibule sank rapidly down until they barely covered the plinths of the first tier of statues. I realized that I was holding on to something. I opened my hand and found a marble finger from some faraway statue that the tides had placed there. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite.
Would you read that part about the finger one more time? I missed its place.
Yeah, it's really something. The waters in the 9th vestibule sank rapidly down until they barely covered the plinths of the first tier of statues. I realized that I was holding on to something. I opened my hand and found a marble finger from some faraway statue that the tides had placed there. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite.
Okay, so the finger. I mean, we have Raphael, or is that the name of the man who made the fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel?
No, Michelangelo.
Thank you. We have Michelangelo's finger of Adam meeting the transcendent at this point of indication. As Jordan Peterson was, not Peterson, even though Peterson was anticipating Peugeot's claim, why are we accustomed to believe that 90% of everything is arbitrary? The outlier is the arbitrary. 98% of everything is normative. So if that is the case, and if it is our presupposition, then why was Michelangelo determined to have the connection point between heaven and earth be at the fingertip? And in this book, what's broken off and what's realized in the aftermath is the finger. And of course, we have in our collective unconscious the stereotype of the strength meeting the weakness of an adult finger and a child's hand.
Yeah, that's the picture that came to my mind, is the way a little tiny little baby will put their tiny little hand around your finger, and their tiny little hand will just cover a little portion of your finger, right?
In the public imaginary, that is domain. That is public domain. And it was there somehow in Michelangelo's blueprint I don't mean to say why, but I mean to say the connection there is not arbitrary.
I love the last sentence of this section of the book. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And I want to say a little bit about that sentence because recently on Twitter, Robert Breedlove, who's a Bitcoin guy, made the statement that you could think of supply and demand as satisfaction and desire.
Okay.
And so I started thinking about that. And as I pondered and thought about it more and more, I came to the conclusion, I could be wrong, but I came to the conclusion that desire is infinite. And I think this is true about the economic system, even without systems, just the way that the world operates, desire is infinite. But satisfaction is finite in this world. The supply will always be less than the demand, which is why economic systems arise to make a way for desires to be managed, because there's always going to be a less than infinite supply for whatever the demand is. So if desire is infinite, I guess C.S. Lewis is the one who makes the argument that because desire is infinite, we know that there is some way for that desire to be fulfilled, but it must be in the next world rather than in this world. And this statement here, the beauty of the house is immeasurable. It can't be measured because it's infinite. And when we first started talking, you made a comment about beauty. I've lost it now. I wrote it down someplace. Oh, that beauty is a material contract with the truth. And the other day I heard somebody who said that beauty is goodness made manifest to the senses.
I believe that.
Yeah, I thought both of those things are so great.
And they partake of the three verities, which can also be held up as artistic criteria: truth, goodness, and beauty. To have any of those in isolation for too long leads to a phantom limb, a phantom sense that something is missing. And we will not be satisfied until whatever is missing is brought into relation. So next to beauty, we must have goodness. And next to goodness, we must have truth.
Well, you said that beauty is a contract with the truth, and he said beauty is goodness made manifest to the senses. And it seems to me from all the conversations that I've had and from all the pondering that I've done that all of these triads are actually a binary and then a boundary or something that holds the binary together. So we have truth and goodness being held together somehow by beauty, truth and goodness being surrounded by beauty or being sheltered with beauty.
And beauty and truth, I love what you just said there. And then just the converse of that, truth and goodness being what beauty is responsible for, what keeps beauty from just going out into the outer perimeter and disappearing, receding. Why does beauty seem to be something that is concerned and wants to wrap its arms around? Because beauty takes on its shoulder the responsibility for goodness and truth. Goodness can't just go anywhere. Truth can't just be anything. And so they are kind of small. Sometimes truth can be very stiff-necked. And beauty has to stand by and make allowances for and constantly forgive. But what does it mean for beauty to forgive? These things. These things were the diet of our ancestors for 1,000+ years.
And now we think we're too good to talk about this stuff.
I know.
In the world. So the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. We live in a world of measurement. Just the other day, I did a conversation with Wolfgang Smith, who is a physicist who has written a number of beautiful books, The Vertical Ascent, Ancient Wisdom, Cosmos and Transcendence. And he makes the argument that the modern world has become the world, well, and I think he's getting this from René Guénon, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Guenon, who talks about the world split into a world of quantity and a world of quality. And was it Kant that did that, or Descartes that did that? But anyway, we're stuck with this world of quantities and that the world of qualities is just in our minds. There are no qualities to the things in the world. The things are just quantities that we can measure and that we can take apart and we can analyze and we can atomize and we can break it down to the smallest component. But this says that the beauty of the house is immeasurable. It can't be measured. And, one of the things that the Israelites got into trouble for over and over and over again was for counting, for measuring, right? There's something very arrogant about thinking that we can divide things up and decide when we have enough or not enough, and all the measuring and counting thing.
I remember my priest said on Sunday, or was it Saturday, when we were commemorating St. John, the theologian, and he died over 100 years old. And when he was buried, he walked with his disciples to a plot of land, and he pointed at it and made the sign of the cross and instructed them how he wished to be buried. So when he did repose, they built a cross, they dug a cross in that plot of ground and put him in there, covered it, and shortly thereafter, this white stuff, dust stuff, would accumulate every now and then on the surface of the grass. And people come up and they would just say, "What is it?"
That's the question of manna, isn't it? Exactly. What is it? Yeah.
Manna means, what is it? And it's not, bread. Obviously, it's the wafer. That's what it is. It's like, it's honey. No, it might taste like honey, but also remember, they were promised a land flowing with milk and honey. It tasted like hope more than honey. That was in their frame. It tasted like the foretaste. But also, what is it? We don't know what it is. And we don't know how it comes out of the sky. And we don't know if it'll ever come again. There are promises, but we don't know what it is today, what it will be tomorrow. This thing was showing up on the quote unquote grave site of St. John, and people were picking it up and they were being healed miraculously to this day. And the what is it, in other words, has not left us. It's not there in the desert in the annals of history. What is it is at the edge of everyone's bed when they wake up in the morning. You see, it might connect in some respect to Jordan Peterson's field of potential. That's what we've missed. I just thought of this right now. Somehow, Karen, we have to figure out how to articulate in the field of perception, in the field of possibility. We talked about it in terms of computation, right? And narrowing down into canonical choices so that we can relieve ourselves of the combinatorial explosion. But we have yet to talk about the recurrent theme of what is it along the way. Maybe that's where the phenomena shines through. Maybe that's part of the what is it, but it does not exhaust the manna. So in this age where we love to talk now about human consciousness and how that gets us past the extensa, the res extensa, and maybe into some qualified territory, there at that meeting place, we will find manna. And we want to scaffold how we will talk about the manna that we find there on our way, which is really a question of how we can relate to each other's what is it.
Well, this is one of the things that Wolfgang Smith talks about, is that Descartes dividing the world into res cogitan, is that the right pronunciation? Like that, yeah. Res cogitan and res extensa was the great criminal error that has kind of confined all of us to the prison of our own minds and the futility of scientific endeavor.
That's good.
He does distinguish between scientism and science, and he's all in favor of science. He himself is a physicist and a scientist of, I would say, great repute. He graduated at the age of 18 with 3 degrees in physics, mathematics, and philosophy.
That's amazing.
and then he went on to higher degrees later, but I mean, his undergraduate, he graduated at the age of 18. So he's definitely a scientist, but he distinguishes scientism because it's so empty and vacuous, because it makes of this world only what we can, kind of what plays on the screen inside our brains, rather than this world actually being substantive. And so he describes the world of substance as the corporeal realm. It's the realm of body. You know, if you divided up the universe into, if you divided up the human body, the human person into 3 parts, you'd get corpus, animus, spiritus, body, soul, and spirit. That's the way they used to talk about it, you know, back with Greek philosophers, I think. And likewise, if you think of the universe as being tripartite like that, then the circumference would be the body, or the corporeal, the corpus, the corporeal realm. And the center would be the spirit, the divine, the transcendent God. He doesn't use the word God because he's speaking scientifically. And then the inner part of the circle, all the rest of that would be the what he calls the intermediary realm. And the intermediary realm would correspond with the anima, in the human person would correspond with the anima, the soul. But in the realm of physics, the motion from the utmost high to the edge of the circumference is an instantaneous observation that causes the potential to become concrete.
Yep.
And it's instantaneous. It's not a horizontal causation, it's a vertical causation. And in fact, there can't be a horizontal causation that can cause the wave to become a particle, because when you're doing that measurement of the observation, you have a measuring machine that tells exactly when the moment of observation happens, so that they can see the concretization of the particle. Those are in 2 different realms, because the particles are in the quantum realm, but the measuring machine is many levels up from that. The measuring machine is corporeal. It's a machine, and it doesn't dwell in the quantum realm. So there can't be a horizontal causation that's happening in the quantum realm that is causing these things to happen. It has to happen from above, and it's an instantaneous and not a temporal act.
Something we'll find in Piranesi, we don't have to read the section, and I don't believe it gives the plot away to say it, but it's a descriptive choice. When she describes the character moving to different parts, it's like a light shining in the darkness. right? You don't have the clear, shining bird's eye view over a city. And then you've seen the marketplace overhead, you've seen the city hall, you've seen all the little suburbs and some birds flying up there. And now you go into the first person consciousness and walk around. It's like radar. Comes around the line, boom, caught something. Northwest section, that's where I'll go. I have a couple hallways there that I know about. I know there's more, but I don't know how much more. It's darkness, it's dark matter. And I'm going to go up there. She does that from this bird's eye view in darkness, which I think is magnificent from a technical standpoint, and a choice in not giving away what the house looks like. She gives us parts every now and then, but she doesn't give us, oh, it's a Gothic mansion. It's so much is left in darkness for now. And that bird's eye view, it's very important in this breaking of the extensa from the mind's ability to grasp stuff here and now. Since the 1500s onwards, you find it in Hegel. You found it in Spinoza, was one of the first people to talk about this explicitly in his Ethics, where he tried to make geometrical propositions map onto ethical precepts. So how do we know what's in it for humans to be virtuous? We would know in the same way that we would know what is in it for us to define rigorously a straight line, because then we can get a circle and its radii and circumference and area under a curve, which ultimately means we can build bridges and arcs and domes. Don't you want all that? Yes. Well, in the same way, we can have all the human flourishing if we attend to these small, little, minor wheel turns in the cognition and find what is known without doubt. In other words, a method for going from horizontal cause to another horizontal cause in a chain of argument. Eventually, down there, horizontally, we will find free speech. We'll find it somewhere along the way. We'll find also somewhere down the line in this horizontal causation of our method, diplomacy. So that they will take their swords and melt them down into plowshares. We'll eventually find that down there, the panacea, the utopia. But until then, we're going to stick with geometrical propositions, because Euclid showed that was without doubt. But one of his phrases for as you look down vertically to these geometrical propositions, because it was akin for him to having a theological revelation, this certainty that I am experiencing must be the same certainty of the creator, because it's without gaps. And the infinite is without gaps. Therefore, this certainty is infinite. But it's infinite so long as I stay on this little beam of attention. The moment I go to the right or to the left, like a proverb says, and start asking about free speech or human rights, it's a wash with opinion. So just stay with the infinite as far as I can. He gave a Latin phrase for that. Sub speciae or speciae aeternatis. So the species below the eternal, or the eternal view down to the species. Sub. However you want to parse out the grammar. The radar in the descriptive passage of the house in this book is sub speciae aeternatis. It's only fixing on what he's already written down and calculated in his book. In the northwest section, there's a little hallway here. I don't know what else is there, but insofar as I can infinitely know with precision, I can say it's there. Like a radar can infinitely know that dot is there. We don't know if it's a huge plane with warheads or if it's an Alaska Airlines. We don't know, but we know something's there infinitely. We can put our finger on it. No, really?
Yes, I think that's a beautiful picture. I mean, I also get the picture of, because I was a drama major in college, it's like a spotlight on a darkened stage. The set is there, we just can't see it. We can only see the person that's in the spotlight and where they go. And so this spotlight sort of follows him around, or he is evincing the spotlight as he writes. He's kind of exposing aspects of the house to us as he writes. To me, the brilliance of it is, how on earth did she keep the whole thing in her head in a way that she could just reveal it to us piece by piece in a flow of time? I mean, it's just such a magnificent endeavor.
And that relates to,
I feel that way about almost any book, but particularly this book.
This book makes that concern one of its central problematics. And so it's really a story of how consciousness attends over time to things in a vertical, while the horizontal must begin to emanate out. The bud must flower out. The thing about a flower is all the petals fall horizontally and eventually stop. Otherwise, you no longer have and never had a flower to begin with. But where precisely in its gene is the program there for it to know when to stop, so it can be a flower and not everything?
I was just listening to Michael. Right? I was just listening to Michael Levin, the biochemist who works with cellular communication, talking about that today, that very thing, that like when a planaria gets cut in half and it rebuilds itself into two planaria, how do the cells know when to stop when they're remodeling to make the other side of the planaria? And he's a brilliant guy, and he's been focusing on nothing but this for years, and he has no idea how the cells know when to stop.
When I was in college, a popular writer was Rob Bell, and he wrote a book about, well, many of his books are about the same problematic, namely, it's in our zeitgeist back in 2008, 2010, and to think that heaven is out there, beyond afterlife. So what we do now doesn't really matter for our life. And so we might as well live staid, STAID lives and wait to die. Well, when you present that to someone, especially a young person, where's the challenge in that? Where's the hope in that? Other than, well, if you can't sit at home and wait, punch the clock and wait to be ejected from this life into the next paradise, then you're not faithful. And he made it his aim to attack that presupposition in the early 2000s. I don't think that question is asked out loud anymore, but I think it's sort of simmering. And one way I think to go around it nowadays is to say, think about it in cases and moods. So as we've been saying, a steady diet for the ancients was to ask about the true, the good, and the beautiful and how they related, and to contemplate the levels of being all the way up to, as you said, past the corporeal or to the corporeal. I mean, think of how that would affect landscape paintings to actually believe that. Right? The vanishing point now is no longer this theory in a textbook. It's precisely where the spirit is in nature for the eye. It's where the eye goes but doesn't see. And so as a landscape painter, if you believed that about the vanishing point in the center of the corporeal, you would be thinking as you painted a landscape that you were doing far more than putting paint on wood. You were literally establishing and representing the cosmos and the inner cosmos by honoring the perspective of the vanishing point for the optics, blah, blah, blah. And so you would think about, the true, the good, the beautiful while you were connecting the dots, and it was all one vertically. The mood in grammar, people also spend so much time in tranquilizing themselves. not with cigarettes, not with alcohol, but with Greek, with Hebrew, with Latin, languages they wouldn't use on the street, but they would just they would inoculate themselves. They would calm themselves down by repeating the vowels and the tenses and seeing how it diagrammed. And I did this the other day at work when I had a little bit of downtime. It sounds silly, but I wrote pleroma and then I wrote the Greek letters for it. And it was just, nothing was accomplished, but it was sort of satisfying to finitely take all those letters that I'm used to and putting them in this other language. And it was rote and it was calming, almost tranquilizing. And to know then that I could do that later when I'm kind of a little annoyed at whatever, I could just do my Greek. There's more going on there. In the same way, finally, talking about moods in grammar, there's the accusative mood, and we could be accusative all day long, but why limit ourselves to that mood? We can also indicate. So instead of thinking of heaven as the beyond, the place we're waiting for, if we think of the indicative mood as this coffee cup, right? This conversation, these words, all the this is in the these, instead of the that and the there, the over there, we have some place to begin and a place to emanate out from. As far as we want to explore, knowing then we can come back to the this. And whether or not we like it, we always come back to the this. We always indicate, even in our ecstasies, spiritual, theological, contemplative, we nevertheless elastically come back. And that's the indicative mood. And Hegel, at the end of German idealism, made this the starting point for his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, in conversation with Kant, in conversation with the limit. All right, the limit is the normative, and the normative is the limit. And our mind simply can't grasp what the measure is in itself. We can only measure up to the thing. Say this cup is a certain height, a certain width, has certain chemical compositions in the coffee. But that's as close as we can come. And as the moment we come to that, we've met the limit of our minds, which is to say we've met what our minds are for. We never encroach the thing, the an sich, in itself. And yet there, the thing in itself can greet us and open the door from the inside out, from its inside out to us. But that is done through faith. That is done through other energies than the measured. Now, when he began his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, where in a novel form, Hegel wrote fiction before he wrote philosophy. He wanted to start with the indicative mood because I thought that's the natural place for us to see what science is. Start with us being able to say, well, this is a cup. I am standing here, sitting, talking to you now. Okay. Where can we go from the now and the this without getting lost and untethering ourselves from the indicative mood? That was his procedure. That's the idealist project. And I went too long, but it very much relates to this suturing, the attempt to suture the extension with the thinking again.
I'm going to have to think about that for a while because there are a lot of things there that I'm not familiar with, but I'm going to go back over it and ponder it. I did want to just say before we leave Rob Bell altogether is that I don't know what kind of teaching he had that he would come up with that as a problem in 2008, because I've been a believer since 1980. I was already in my 30s when I became a Christian. And one of the very first things that I learned is that when you cross over from unbelief to belief, you become a citizen of heaven. We are citizens of heaven now. It's not as though that is something that happens when I die. I am a citizen of heaven now. And as such, as a citizen, I have certain perspectives and responsibilities and opportunities and relationships, and just as you would as a citizen of any other country. We are strangers here. This is not our home. I mean, there are hundreds, if not more, verses in the scripture that talk about our progress through this life as citizens of heaven. So to come out and say that, oh, well, the church has always said that we're just living this boring state life now until someday we die and go to heaven. That's the old-fashioned argument against Christianity, that all you dumb Christians are just pie in the sky by and by. And it's an old attack. And I think it's a fruitless attack because it's completely straw man. It's not looking at all at what authentic Christianity has taught through the centuries. So I just want to lay that there.
Oh, I agree with you. But I have been subject to it early in years ago. I thought, I won't even say years ago. I will say months ago. Under the sway of Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, a play which haunts me still, more in good ways than in bad. I
was in a Beckett play one time, but it wasn't Waiting for Godot. It's the other one. I can't remember the name of it, where the mother and father are each hidden inside a trash barrel. And then, yes, and I was the mother. So 90% of the play, I'm down inside a trash barrel waiting for my moment to rise up and say something. So when you've been on the inside of a Beckett play, you have a lot less respect for what he's talking about.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
Anyway,
Wow.
if there's something in Waiting for Godot that has troubled you all your life because you thought that Beckett was some great genius, I think you can lay that to rest.
Well, that's good to know, because it probably was his use of the ... the things he did not say that I thought were, well, if he didn't say it, then it must be so big he can't say it. He can only glance at it or wink after he said something that didn't make a whole lot of sense, but he winks at the end. So now everything he said that didn't make sense takes on this new importance because he winked at the end.
It's also a very easy way to appear to be profound. The scripture told us that years ago. He who does not speak can easily appear wise.
And so I thought the ideal was to live standing by a barren tree with one other person that spoke past me and I spoke past them until Godot showed up. And I admit that was something I couldn't shake off, like an old coat that it's so heavy that the moment I try to do the Superman thing and take it off, but then I'm like, oh, that's so heavy. Tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow. But going through the Red Sea, and actually becoming a Christian, it does take off the old man. And I have to remember the old man is gone with his coat, and his non sequiturs and his winks at the end of every sentence. But it is gone, but relatively, it tries to find elbow room on the table of my memory. And hence why I, as a writer now, wish to interrogate lovingly and longingly books like this, which have an agenda of articulating so far the true good, the good, and the beautiful.
I hope that you will send me those 4 paragraphs that you wrote, because
Okay.
I would, if it's not too long, I'd like to put it in the description section of the video, because I think it's so beautiful. And I hope you're continuing to write, because
I am.
you are a gifted writer, and it would be probably a tragedy for those of us who are waiting for your book, but you're also a gifted teacher. And I would love to be a college student sitting in one of your classes.
May I share one quick thing
Yes.
about that? So I have been diligent, and I made so many neat contacts where I live slowly, but I had to put my foot out the door and put the other foot in front of the other foot, and then walk myself to the coffee shop, and then sit there and wait. And then sure enough, old friends met new friends who introduced me to other friends. And in the introducing of friend to friend to friend to friend, Movable Type, which is the tentative title for the book of historical drama set in 1841, University of Berlin, it was shown to me that my archetype is Hermann Hesse's Narcissus and Goldsman. So I'm reading that very carefully because it sets up these two friends that are at polar Barfieldian opposites. And I'm seeing where Soren fits in with Felix in Movable Type. And I'm close to at least having 60 pages of a screenplay done for Movable Type. Mid-June is when my boss asked me to give it to her for her sister. And my goal is to have 60 pages of that pilot done. And nice thing about a screenplay is it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. The sentences do not have to be all that you want them to be. You need to have the nouns, and you need to have verbs. They don't even have to be the right verbs, but just verbs with the right nouns, as if all the nouns were capitalized. And then a lot of white space and dialogue that can be changed at any moment.
Yeah, the spaces between is what makes a screenplay, right?
Exactly. So that's what I hope to have on the way to Movable Type by mid-June for this dear friend of mine. And so with that said, the train is moving.
That's exciting. Can we continue with this book next time?
I'd love to. It's a great book.
We made it 2 pages. But I think if we even get through the first section of the book, it would give people a good foundation from which to read the rest of the book. So I am eagerly awaiting our next opportunity to get together. Thank you so much, Matt.
Oh, thank you, Karen. Have a good night.
Okay, bye-bye.